Distinguidas delegaciones.
Distinguished delegations, we will now proceed with the consideration of the outcome of India based on the report of the Working Group on the Universal Periodic Review of India as contained in documents A/HRC/36/10 and A/HRC/36/10/1. This report and its addendum, together with the additional information that will now be provided by India, will constitute the outcome of the review and shall be adopted by the Council through a standardized decision. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Rajiv Kumar Chander, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary and Permanent Representative of India to the United Nations Office at Geneva, to present additional information on the review. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to deliver this inaugural statement at the UPR segment of the 36th section of the Human Rights Council today, adopting the final report of a third cycle review under the UPR process. On behalf of my delegation, I would like to thank the OHCHR Secretariat for their able assistance in finalizing the report. I would also like to thank the Troika of India's review, Latvia, the Philippines and South Africa for their dedication and contribution to our UPR process. Mr. President, India is a firm supporter of the Universal Periodic Review since its inception in 2006. We value the distinctly universal and peer review nature of this mechanism, which is supported by all. The review platform is conducive for open engagement amongst member states and other stakeholders to address issues relating to human rights. UPR is a mechanism that encourages member states to strengthen the human rights record and learn from the best practices of others. As a responsible member of the United Nations, India remains committed towards meaningful engagement with international organizations as well as individual states in a constructive spirit. Mr. President, India is a vibrant, pluralistic democracy founded on strong democratic principles. The Indian Constitution guarantees fundamental rights to all its citizens. We are convinced that inclusive and equitable development is the key to securing a life of dignity, security, empowerment and freedom for all. My government has put in place a set of robust socio-economic policies to address various basic needs of the people, including health, education, housing, poverty alleviation, women empowerment, food security, social security, and so on. It is in this background that we submitted our third cycle review report. It reflects the current state of play in the implementation of previous recommendations and the progress made in other related areas. We have not hesitated to acknowledge the challenges that we confront in implementation of some of the recommendations. Most of these challenges stem from the complexity and diversity of the Indian society. However, our endeavor remains to make progress in the fullest implementation of our commitments under various human rights instruments. During the third cycle review held in May this year, India received 250 recommendations. We are pleased to report that after extensive consultations and deliberations, 152 recommendations have been accepted and the remaining 98 have been taken note of. We thank all states and stakeholders for their active participation in India's review and their valuable recommendations. Mr. President, we give utmost importance to consistently building upon and further improving the standards of human rights achieved so far in India. We are working towards ensuring that our policies and schemes are aimed at progressively giving the people of India a life with dignity and respect. Thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias, señor embajador.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for that presentation. In accordance with paragraph 13 of Human Rights Council Resolution 16/21, I will now give the floor to the representative of the National Human Rights Commission of India. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. As the National Human Rights Commission India had observed in its submission for this current review, challenges to safeguarding of human rights in the country remain in spite of an independent and active judiciary, free media and an alert civil society. It was also observed that several recommendations received during the second review are yet to be implemented. It is hoped and expected that there will be better implementation of the recommendations being accepted by the Government of India in this review. We propose to work with both the government as well as the civil society towards implementation of these recommendations. We will also strive to disseminate and give publicity to the outcome of this review amongst all the stakeholders for this purpose. We have examined the recommendations in detail. They pertain to civil and political rights as well as economic, social and cultural rights, and also rights of disadvantaged sections of society. Several of them do have relevance to the human rights situation of our country and hence require serious implementation. We have also found the recommendations to be large in aggregate number and received from several participating countries, indicative of coming to maturity of the UPR mechanism. At the same time, the process of successive reviews will have utility only if governments work in a steadfast manner to achieve the implementation of recommendations they accept. In the end, it is reiterated that the National Human Rights Commission India will work with all stakeholders towards effective implementation of all recommendations before the next review. Thank you, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias. Me permito.
Thank you very much. Now, before giving the floor to the member and observer states for their comments on the outcome of the review, I would like to inform you respectfully that the speaking time has been set for everyone at 1 minute and 30 seconds for all states. I will now open the floor to member and observer states. China has the floor.
主席先生，中国代表。
Mr. President, the Chinese delegation welcomes Indian delegation's constructive approach to UPR. We appreciate Indian government's commitment to active efforts to implement the accepted recommendations. We appreciate India's acceptance of China's recommendations, including those on continued efforts to promote economic, social and sustainable development, improve people's living standard, and guarantee the rights of people with disabilities, the elderly and vulnerable groups, adopt effective legislature and law enforcement measures to combat violence against women. We appreciate India's efforts to eliminate poverty and achieve inclusive, sustainable development. We recognize India's measures to guarantee people's right to health, education, housing and food. China is in favor of the Council's adoption of the UPR report on India. Thank you, Mr. President.
Côte d'Ivoire tiene el uso de la palabra.
Côte d'Ivoire has the floor.
Thank you, sir. Côte d'Ivoire bids a warm welcome to the delegation of India for the adoption of their report under the UPR, and we thank India for the replies and additional information provided. My delegation appreciates the interest shown by India in the recommendations made during the UPR, and we remain convinced that their implementation will significantly help to improve the human rights situation in that country. Sir, we commend the overall efforts on the part of the Indian government to promote and protect human rights, and we encourage India to continue full cooperation with the international community. Finally, my country calls upon this Council to adopt the final report from the UPR for India. Thank you.
La distinguida delegación de Cuba.
The distinguished delegation of Cuba has the floor. Mr. President, we reaffirm our appreciation to India for the progress made in protecting and promoting all human rights. In spite of the challenges facing it, we very much value the strides forward taken in the country in the area of education for early childhood, child labor, and the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities, inter alia. In addition, we would like to thank India for having accepted the 2 recommendations put forward by Cuba relating to measures being implemented to combat trafficking in persons and the gender perspective issue. We wish India all success in the promotion and protection of all human rights. Thank you very much.
Egipto tiene el uso de la palabra.
Egypt has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to warmly welcome the delegation of India in this meeting for the adoption of the report under UPR. Mr. President, during the review, Egypt commended the government's efforts to provide more resources with a view to securing the enjoyment of all groups of their economic and social rights, particularly the vulnerable groups such as women, children, the poor, and faith holders. India has undertaken to promote transparency and openness, particularly when it comes to having free access to information. We also appreciate India's steps to empower women in the marketplace with a view to securing decent working conditions, as well as the empowerment of the economic and social empowerment of women in general, and providing good education, decent education for all children. We also welcome the government's acceptance of Egypt's recommendations by India with a view to putting an end to poverty and achieve sustainable development for all. We, in conclusion, wish India all success and continued efforts to promote and protect human rights. Thank you.
Estonia tiene el uso de la palabra.
Estonia has the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished delegation of the Republic of India, Estonia would like to commend the delegation of India for its constructive participation in the third cycle of the UPR process, and thank you for the statement made today. We welcome the positive approach taken by the government of India to accept more than 2/3 of the 250 recommendations made on a very wide range of issues. Estonia commends the commitment of the government to continue to finalize the efforts to ratify the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment, and to take steps to more effectively prevent, prosecute and punish cases of domestic violence, as well as to promote awareness-raising campaigns on gender violence, including honor crimes. At the same time, we regret that the government did not accept recommendations to ratify agreement on the privileged immunities of the ICC and the Kampala amendments of the Rome Statute of the ICC, to ratify OPCAT and the ICCPR Second Option Protocol. Furthermore, we believe that the right to fair trial and a trial within a reasonable term in a court proceeding are an integral part of fundamental rights. We once again recommend the authorities in India to strengthen the independent function of the judiciary in order to reduce delays in judicial proceedings, enhance transparency of the processes, and guarantee a right to speedy trial. Finally, Estonia wishes the government of India every success in the determination and commitment to implement the accepted recommendations. Thank you.
Ethiopia tiene el uso de la palabra.
Ethiopia has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia welcomes the delegation of India to the outcome review of the third UPR. We also thank the delegation for the oral update today. We commend India for accepting many recommendations, including our recommendations aimed at promoting equal access to justice for all, especially by promoting more legal aid to the poor and marginalized, and allocating appropriate resources to reducing backlog and the delays in the administrations of access in courts. We would like to take this opportunity to encourage India to take all necessary measures in advance for the full implementation of the accepted recommendations. Finally, Mr. President, Ethiopia supports the adoption of UPR outcome of India. We wish the delegation of India success in its engagement with the Human Rights Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
Ghana
has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ghana extends a warm welcome to the delegation of India to the adoption of their UPR report. My delegation welcomes the adoption by India of the National Food Security Act to eliminate all forms of malnutrition, including child malnutrition, and the expansion of the coverage of the Integrated Child Development Services Scheme for better nutrition, health, and overall development of children under the age of 6. While acknowledging the efforts being made by the Indian government to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, my delegation urges India to take steps to ratify the UNCAT and its optional protocol. Ghana supports the adoption of the UPR report of India by consensus and wishes the government every success in the implementation of the accepted recommendations. I thank you, Mr. President.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has the floor.
Mr. President, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the Islamic Republic of Iran welcomes the delegation of India and commend its active participation in the third UPR cycle and thank them for its continued efforts to increase the protection and promotion of human rights. We also welcome the efforts of the government towards socio-economic developments, poverty eradication, the increase in the house expenditures and the health insurance plans for family living under the poverty line. Mr. President, my delegation also appreciates the commitment of India to reforming its legal system with a view to protecting and promoting the right of the women and the girl, and some positive achievements such as adoption of the Right of the Person with Disability Act in 2016, adopting the Child Labor Amendment Act, and ratifying the Minimum Age Convention 1973. Mr. President, along with my others, my delegation has also presented a recommendation to India during its UPR working group and hope implemented by the government before the next cycle. In conclusion, we support the adoption of the report of India and wishes its success in the implementation of accepted recommendations. I thank you, Mr. President.
Iraq
has the floor.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, sir. Iraq extends its warm thanks to the delegation of India for the presentation made during this UPR, and we appreciate India's acceptance of the two recommendations made by Iraq. We hope that Council will adopt the report for India, and we commend India on its acceptance of most of the recommendations made to it.
Kyrgyzstan
has the floor.
Mr. President, delegation of Kyrgyzstan welcomes the delegation of India and congratulates on its UPR outcome. We appreciate the positive engagement of India with the Human Rights Council in the UPR process. We commend India for accepting a number of recommendations, including those made by Kyrgyzstan, namely on taking additional serious measures to eliminate violence against women and children, including sexual violence, enhancing activities aimed at eliminating discrimination against women that particularly affects women from lower castes, and accepting more efforts to increase girls' secondary education, including ensuring that schools were girl-friendly and in all parameters. We are convinced that their implementation will enhance the effectiveness of the protection of women and children's rights and well-being. My delegation would like to recommend the adoption of the report on the UPR of India and wishes India every success in implementation of the accepted recommendations. Thank you for your attention.
República Democrática Popular.
The Lao People's Democratic Republic has the floor.
President, my delegation welcomes the delegation of India and would like to thank for its comprehensive presentation and oral update. My delegation commends unwavering efforts of the government of India towards promotion and protection of rights of vulnerable groups, including women, children, and persons with disabilities, by taking steps to promote equal participation of women in the workforce and to combat violence against women. We also commend India's commitment to further enhancing freedom of religions, improving access to healthcare services, addressing poverty, achieving an inclusive, sustainable development, and promoting social security. Lao PDR commends efforts undertaken by the governments of India towards ratification the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. In this connection, we would like to recommend that the UPR report of the India be adopted by the Council. I thank you.
Libya
has the floor.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. في البداية يسر وفد.
Thank you, sir. First of all, a warm welcome to the delegation of India, which we thank for its oral update. We appreciate the commitment of India to continue efforts to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms. It's our hope that India will continue to harmonize its development policies, fitting in with sustainable development in the field of food security, the fight against poverty, and support for health and education. Finally, we wish further progress and prosperity, and we recommend the adoption of the report. Thank you.
Lituania tiene el uso de la palabra.
Lithuania has the floor.
Micrófono.
Microphone, please.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. President. Lithuania warmly welcomes the delegation of India and thanks it for its presentation. We congratulate India on a successful UPR cycle, and we wish continued success in the upcoming work. India has taken positive steps in the context of its human rights commitments towards strengthening national mechanisms and improving the overall human rights record. We appreciate that India has accepted numerous important recommendations made by many countries for this UPR cycle. We wish the government of India successful implementation and look forward to its active participation in the future UPR cycles. At the same time, Lithuania regrets that our own recommendations to India have only been noted without providing explanation. We continue to believe that freedom of expression and free and strong civil society are among key ingredients of democracy and full enjoyment of the fundamental rights and freedoms by all persons. We encourage the government of India to take additional steps in these areas in the future in order to continue improving the country's human rights record. I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias.
Thank you. This was the last state speaker we could accommodate. As per the new practice, all statements, including those which could not be delivered due to time constraints, should have been uploaded online. I will now give the floor to the other stakeholders. I now give the floor to the Center for Reproductive Rights.
During its UPR, India received recommendations to take effective measures to end child marriage, as well as recommendations to address harms that are closely linked to it. These recommendations are crucial to address widespread violations of women and girls' rights for child marriage in India, which accounts for the highest number of child marriages in the world, where 1 in 3 girls marries under the age of 18. Acceptance of these recommendations is only the first step in ending this grave human rights crisis. We urge India to take immediate steps to strengthen accountability for child marriage, including by harmonizing personal laws, laws on domestic and sexual violence, including marital rape, reproductive health, marriage and birth registration, education and dowry, with human rights and constitutional law to ensure a minimum legal age of marriage of 18 and to address gaps and inconsistencies that leave girls vulnerable to child marriage. During this UPR, India also received important recommendations to prevent coercive, unsafe and abusive sterilization and ensure greater accountability for these practices, including ensuring free and full consent prior to conducting the procedure and compliance with international standards. Such measures are crucial to end the targeting and coercion of poor, vulnerable groups of women to undergo sterilization in makeshift and unhygienic settings, resulting in death and suffering. We urge India to end the violence and suffering caused by this practice by implementing recent Supreme Court orders calling for the discontinuation of sterilization camps, ensuring free and full consent prior to conducting sterilization, prohibiting informal and formal targets for all contraceptives, and conducting audits for all sterilization-related death and harm. Thank you, Mr. President.
Minority Right Group.
Minority Rights Group has the floor.
The adoption of India's UPR comes at a crucial time of rising intolerance when religious minorities and members of lower caste groups face high levels of violence and discrimination. Minority Rights Group International, together with Citizens Against Hate and People's Watch, welcome India's acceptance of several recommendations. However, we would like to raise 3 points. First, while better implementation of existing laws and access to appropriate judicial means is crucial in responding to violations against minorities, there is also a clear need to address current legislation and policies which provide a cloak of legitimacy to this violence and discrimination. Anti-cow slaughter legislation has influenced the rise of so-called cow protection units, which have engaged in mob violence and lynchings targeting minorities. We therefore urge government to take steps to reform or repeal anti-cow slaughter and anti-conversion legislation. Second, there remains an urgent need for authorities to investigate incidents of targeted violence, including vigilante violence against Muslims, and hold to account the perpetrators, including public officials where state complicity is involved. We call on Government of India to investigate these incidents without delay and secure relief, reparation and rehabilitation to victims. Finally, in response to the High Commissioner's recent update regarding the recent wave of mob attacks targeting religious minorities, the Government of India has stated that individual incidents are being extrapolated to suggest a broader societal situation. However, this contradicts both media reports and the increasingly at-risk HRDs. We call on the Government of India to immediately begin to take steps to collect and publish comprehensive data on hate crimes, disaggregated by social group and category. I thank you.
Franciscan International.
Franciscans International has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We appreciate the Government of India's acceptance and commitment to ensure that laws are fully and consistently enforced to provide adequate protections for members of religious minorities and other vulnerable populations in its response to proposed UPR recommendations. However, we observe the environment of intolerance and fears among the religious minorities as well as practitioners of freedom of expression, belief, thoughts and assembly in the country. Despite the commitment to implement the recommendations from first and second UPR, the Government of India has not formulated a comprehensive law to prevent communal violence against the religious minorities. The Government of India fails to prevent the adoption of anti-conversion acts prevailing in states such as Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand and Gujarat that restricts the rights of minorities to practice, propagate and profess their religion. In addition, we document the increasing criminalization of minorities, Dalits and Adivasis for eating beef and withdraw cow slaughter acts that are in one form or other almost in many states of India. Similarly, we also document the increase of hate speech delivered by state officials, which leads to the incitement of violence and discrimination against minorities in contrary to their responsibility to protect the minorities. We urge the Government of India to take appropriate and visible action against incidents of mob lynching of minorities and human rights defenders. The Indian government needs to ensure stringent action against all those who deliver hate speech with intention of inciting violence and hatred against religious minorities. It should facilitate to reopen 315 cases and ensure criminal justice delivery system functioned by reopening closed cases without any convictions and enhance appropriate compensation in the anti-Christian violence Odisha in 2007 and 2008. It must take all the necessary measures to stop alarming trends of discrimination, xenophobia and related intolerance and create confidence among all the persons in the country. Finally, Indian government should delete paragraph 3 of the Constitution, Presidential Order.
Thank you very much. International Humanist and Ethical Union has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since its last review, India's secular constitution has been increasingly challenged by a rise in Hindu rationalism. In recent years, several rationalist activists have been killed by extremists, whilst government officials refrained from forcefully condemning the killings. Instead, politicians of the BJP party have voiced derogatory remarks about minorities. India has continued to witness innumerable attacks on Dalits and members of its other minorities. Untouchables are systematically attacked for reasons varying from entering places of worship to skinning dead cows. Accordingly, we commend India's acceptance recommendations made concerning the discrimination of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and those calling for a full and consistent enforcement of the law. However, we were disappointed to note that no recommendation were made concerning the practice of manual scavenging. In 100 days, 39 people from untouchable Dalit community were killed whilst cleaning sewer lines. We urge the government to effectively implement the prohibition of employment as a manual scavengers and their Rehabilitation Act. We were disappointed to see India didn't accept the recommendation that it revise the Armed Forces Act in our areas of the armed forces that have often been given independence to conduct atrocities on the population, whilst investigation agencies are used on selective basis to harass and suppress the voices of dissent. Freedom of dissent is essential to a functioning democracy and keeping a check on power and abuse accordingly. We were extremely disappointed that the recommendations around amending the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act and protecting human rights defenders against harassment and intimidation were not accepted. Thank you.
Asian Forum for Human Rights.
Asia Forum for Human Rights has the floor.
Forum Asia and the Working Group on Human Rights in India and the UN welcome India's government's decision to accept 152 of the 250 recommendations made by 112 states. However, we remain deeply apprehensive at the pattern of ambivalence that emerges from only noting the recommendations that firmly secure the future of our people's civil and political rights. In the light of prevalence of torture and impunity in India, we are deeply disturbed that of the 21 recommendations to ratify the Convention Against Torture, only 13 have been accepted. India has accepted the recommendation to ratify this vital convention since UPR-1, but has throughout failed to act on it. Despite strong evidence of deliberate killings and excessive use of force with impunity by security forces, for the third consecutive time, India has just noted the recommendations related to AFSPA. In the light of increasing hate speech, targeted lynching of minorities and a growing atmosphere of unchecked intolerance, it is surprising and regrettable that India has chosen to note 9 of 16 recommendations on hate speech, repeal of discriminatory laws, a law on preventing communal violence and protecting rights of religious minorities. It is distressing that all 11 recommendations on the rights and freedoms of human rights defenders have merely been noted. No commitment to safeguard defenders against the persecutions, limited use of Foreign Contribution Act, no commitment in response to overwhelming international concerns on the attacks on citizens groups and civil society organizations. We regret also the absence of India's commitment to strengthening the justice delivery system and guaranteeing the independence of the judiciary. We are disheartened that several recommendations on violence against women, ending honor crimes, etc., marital rape have only been noted. We would also like to point out the criminalization of the poor through laws that penalize begging. We welcome India's commitment to combat the practice of child marriage. We cannot help but note that it has not accepted to end this practice, nor has it accepted the recommendations to address sex-selective abortion. Finally, Forum Asia and WGHR call upon the...
Thank you. International Commission of Jurists has the floor.
Mr. President, the International Commission of Jurists regrets that India has not supported recommendations relating to decriminalization of consensual same-sex relations, abolishing the death penalty, and combating impunity for serious human rights violations. The ICJ has documented how by allowing the criminalization of consensual same-sex relations, Section 377 of the Penal Code has facilitated numerous human rights violations, including violations of the principle of non-discrimination, rights to equality before the law and equal protection of the law, liberty and security of person, freedom of expression, health and privacy. Section 377 has also perpetuated homophobic and transphobic attitudes in India, leading to discrimination and violence against LGBT individuals. The government has also failed to take steps to combat impunity for serious human rights violations, including extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances and torture and other ill treatment, facilitated by laws such as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and other national security and public safety legislation. Despite repeated commitments to do so, India has also not yet enacted legislation to recognize torture as a distinct autonomous offense in its penal code. The ICJ therefore urges the government to reconsider, to accept, and to implement UPR recommendations to decriminalize consensual same-sex sexual relations, enact legislation consistent with the Supreme Court's recognition of the rights of transgender persons and international human rights standards, repeal the AFSPA and other similar laws, become party to the numerous treaties that have been recommended, and establish a moratorium on the use of the death penalty with a view towards its abolition. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Allied Rainbow Communities.
Allied Rainbow Communities has the floor.
We strongly welcome the judgment of the Indian Supreme Court in Puttaswamy versus Union of India, where the court declared that the right to privacy is protected under the Constitution. We also note that the Supreme Court has observed that the decision recriminalizing the lives of LGBT persons was a discordant note in its jurisprudence, and strongly reiterated that LGBT persons are entitled to the right to privacy and dignity like all other citizens. We urge the Union of India to act in accordance with the Supreme Court ruling and to take all necessary action to protect the rights of LGBT citizens, including the repeal of Section 377 and full compliance with the Supreme Court decision in Nalsa versus the Union of India. We know that the bill on transgender rights, currently pending with Parliament, fails to meet the standard. We also note with concern the rising tide of intolerance, which has created a climate that allows for brutal violence against minorities and dissenting voices, including lynchings and targeted assassinations. As the High Commissioner notes in his report, the current wave of violent and often lethal mob attacks against persons under the pretext of protecting the lives of cows is alarming. Gauri Lankesh, an independent journalist, freethinker, and critic of the government, is the latest victim in the string of assassinations which includes Pansare, Dabolkar and Kalburgi. We urge the government of Karnataka to take swift action to nab the culprits and urge the Union of India to condemn the latest killings in no uncertain terms and also outline a plan of action to respond to these forms of hate crimes and the hate propaganda that foments vilification of diverse viewpoints. The values which animate the Indian Constitution include inclusiveness, plurality and the liberty of thought expression, belief, faith and action, and these are at stake today. These values are nurtured through the vigorous actions of a vibrant Indian civil society which is under threat today. India must act to protect these freedoms and thereby keep alive the values of the Constitution if it is to continue to take pride in being recognized as the world's largest democracy. Thank you, Mr. President.
Christian Solidarity Worldwide has the floor. Joint statement.
President, Christian Solidarity Worldwide, together with World Evangelical Alliance, commends India on its engagement with the UPR in May 2017. During the review, the government mentioned that it is committed to ensure a safe environment for human rights defenders. Yet the space for journalists, writers and other human rights defenders who question Hindu right-wing politics and dissent is quickly deteriorating. The recent murder of editor Gauri Lankesh, who spoke against blatant attacks on freedom of expression and minority rights, is indicative of wider crackdown on free speech and thought. During the UPR, several delegations urged India to retract its anti-conversion laws. The UN Special Rapporteurs on Freedom of Religion or Belief, who previously visited India, have been deeply concerned about the effects of these laws, which are procedurally flawed, providing the state with sweeping powers to interfere in the individual's choice of religion. Equally, these laws continue to be used to foster harassment, intimidation and violence against religious minorities. We are deeply concerned by India's failure to review its anti-conversion laws known as Freedom of Religion Acts, which are already fully enforceable in 6 states. For instance, Jharkhand state in northern India signed an anti-conversion bill into law on September 5th. The new law criminalizes conversion through allurement, force and fraud, but lacks a clear definition of these terms. Conviction carries a prison sentence up to 3 years and or a fine up to 50,000 rupees. We call on the Government of India to implement its constitutional guarantees granting every citizen the right to profess and practice their religion or belief, and to ensure that the voice of dissent against oppression and injustice is protected. Thank you, Mr. President.
Amnesty International.
Amnesty International has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Amnesty International welcomes India's support of recommendations to improve access to health, education and housing and to reduce poverty. However, we regret that India rejected important specific recommendations to reduce discrimination and violence against marginalized groups, to respect the freedom to dissent and to reduce impunity for human rights violations. It is unfortunate that India has rejected specific recommendations to recognize marital rape as a criminal offense, to decriminalize same-sex relations and to establish a plan to combat hate crimes against people of African descent. India has also done far too little to tackle incidents of mob violence against Muslims and widespread discrimination against Dalit and Adivasi communities. The freedom to dissent is increasingly under threat in India. The government's rejection of recommendations to amend the NGO foreign funding law to align communication surveillance and restrictions on online expression with international human rights standards and to independently investigate attacks on journalists raises troubling questions about its commitment to protecting the rights to freedom of expression and association. We also regret India's rejection of recommendations to repeal the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which has contributed to a culture of impunity for human rights violations by security forces, and also to ban inherently inaccurate pellet-firing shotguns that have blinded and killed hundreds. These rejections, unfortunately, paint a grim picture of India's commitment to upholding human rights and respecting its international obligations. By taking steps recently to forcibly return all Rohingya refugees and asylum seekers to Myanmar, where they may face serious human rights violations, India risks failing its moral and legal obligations. We urge India to drop these measures, which are unbecoming of a country that has a tradition of providing refuge to people fleeing persecution. We welcome India's support of recommendations to ratify the UN Convention Against Torture, which it signed in 1997. Thank you, Mr. President.
Action Canada.
Action Canada has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Action Canada makes the statement on behalf of the Sexual Rights Initiative. We welcome the fact that 12 countries had recommendations to India regarding the need to recognize marital rape as a form of rape. However, we are deeply concerned that India has not accepted any of these recommendations and that it continues to favor the exception of marital rape. Only a few days ago, on the 29th of August 2017, in an affidavit filed before the Delhi High Court, the central government stated, and I quote, "It has to be ensured adequately that marital rape does not become a phenomena which may destabilize the institution of marriage, apart from being an easy tool for harassing the husbands." India's commitment under CEDAW and other international instruments require it to recognize marital rape as a serious form of violence against women, punishable under its laws. In India's 4th and 5th periodic review under CEDAW, the committee observed that Indian rape laws need to reflect the realities of sexual abuse experienced by women and to remove the exception of marital rape from the definition of rape. Further, while India received 8 recommendations on access to healthcare, education and other benefits for persons with disabilities, we are disappointed that specific issues faced by women with disabilities were not addressed by the Council. While laws on violence against women are applicable to women with disabilities, however, systems and procedures are not equipped to deal with specific concerns of women with disabilities. All recommendations concerning the rights of people with disabilities should incorporate the reality of human rights violations faced specifically by women and girls with disability. We strongly call upon the Indian government to implement the recommendations on removing the exception to marital rape in its penal laws, to put the institution of marriage before the basic human rights of a person to be free from sexual violence is unacceptable. We also urge the Indian government to recognize and address the holistic sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls with disability and its impact on issues across access in accordance with General Comment 3 of the CRPD. Thank you.
Gracias. Ha sido
Thank you. That was the last speaker we could accommodate. Before giving the floor to the delegation of India for its concluding remarks, allow me to note that based on the information provided, out of the 250 recommendations received, 152 enjoy your support, while you take note of the remaining 98. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Rajiv Kumar Chander, for his concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of my delegation, I would like to thank the OHCHR Secretariat, the Troika for India's Review, Latvia, the Philippines and South Africa, and all the states and other stakeholders for their contributions to our UPR process. India, the world's largest democracy, is home to a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic population that has lived together for millennia with an ethos of respect for diversity and plurality. It was therefore natural that independent India adopted a rights-oriented constitutional framework with a secular polity and independent judiciary. A range of national and state-level commissions that monitor compliance with human rights, a free press, and a vibrant and vocal civil society act as the vigilant guardians of rights and freedoms in India. Given the hopes and aspirations of around 1,300 million Indians, we continue to prioritize, through a range of protective and affirmative measures, the attainment of liberty and development for all. In the spirit of leaving no one behind, India follows the motto of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, all together and development for all. India recognizes the high importance of the UPR mechanism. We view UPR as a unique mechanism that sets the Council apart from its predecessor and has served as an effective and visible vehicle for advancement of human rights. Mr. President, India is one of the first countries that has successfully completed the review process in the beginning of its third cycle. We now work towards implementation of the 152 recommendations which the Government of India has accepted. We also remain mindful of the remaining 98 recommendations noted by us. Maintaining a firm commitment to the UPR process, we would like to underscore that national priorities and interests deserve due recognition as we adapt our UPR commitments into positive developments on the ground. I would also like to take this opportunity to wish all states success in implementing the UPR commitments, taking into account their own social, political and economic circumstances. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency for his presentation and for the fruitful participation of India in the entire UPR process. Distinguished delegations, I would now propose that the Council adopts the decision on the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of India as it appears on the screen. I see no objections. The decision is adopted. Thank you very much. We will briefly suspend the meeting before proceeding with the consideration of the outcome of Brazil. Thank you very much.